Trigger warning. This is a hard-hitting episode which covers topics including mental illness, mental health, suicide, drug abuse, and violence.
The content here should not be taken as medical or professional advice. This content is for informational purposes only. You are advised to refrain from listening to this episode or podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics, so listener discretion is advised.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, I'm Georgie.
And I'm VG.
Welcome to our podcast, Diversity and Inclusion Satisfying the Tick Box.
In today's episode, we'll be covering mental health.
So we have another very special guest joining us today, George Sullivan, who will be sharing his personal journey and experiences with mental health. George, if you could just give us a quick introduction, let the listeners know who you are and a bit about your story.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure. So my name is George. I'm 25 years old and I live in Banstead in Surrey. I'm the middle child of an older sister and a non-binary younger sibling, and I currently live with my mum and dad. I grew up in an all-boys state school and used to be quite an avid footballer, which led to me securing a sport and academic scholarship to the United States to play soccer. After that not working out, I then came back to the UK and went to Oxford Brookes University, where I studied business and management. And following that, and from my own experiences, I am now a mental health and suicide prevention public speaker. I have my own talk show called Sully's Open Conversation. And I'm also the head of operations at Optimal Minds, which is a psychological strategy consultant.
That's very cool. I have actually been on the talk show. It's a fabulous one. Definitely go and check it out. Yeah, George, could you just give a bit of background on you, kind of growing up and just on your mental health struggles?
Yeah, so I suppose I first encountered what I didn't know was depression and suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts. I was about 14 years old. And I kind of mentioned that I grew up in an all-boys state secondary school because I feel like that's quite a key component to the environment in which I grew up in. Toxic masculinity is 120% a thing. We were kind of taught to not really talk about our emotions. If you did show your emotions, it was kind of a sign of weakness, which still occurs in society today. So there was kind of a lot of, let's call it banter, but some people can either take it better than others, I suppose. So it kind of started from there, but I was getting incredibly negative, down, suicidal thoughts. And I, at 14, 15 years old, began self-harming and kind of was starting to plan suicide, which obviously at that age you may find shocking. Some people may not, because it can onset as young as kind of 10 years old. But from then, I was lucky enough to be spotted by a teacher because I was kind of walking out of lessons a lot, was being less responsive. And I got to see a school counsellor. So talking about my problems to actually someone, I kept it from my parents. I didn't want my parents to know. I was very ashamed and embarrassed. So being able to have that outlet to talk to someone about the struggles was definitely allowed me to understand them more and allowed me to process my emotions. And then I got back into football. I was injured at the time. So the physical exercise, of course, as well as the talking therapy, allowed me to really improve my mental health. Fast forward to March 2020, which was the start of lockdown, which was obviously a very horrible time for a lot of us. We were locked in our homes, couldn't go out and see friends. I was actually on placement at the time. So I was in my third year at university then, and I was furloughed. So for everyone that doesn't know what that is, I wasn't working, but I was fortunate enough to still be paid. However, that then left me to my own thoughts. I didn't have any distraction anymore. I was living a kind of very intense lifestyle, going out a lot, working a lot and not really having the time to myself. So when that did happen, those thoughts started to come back again, and I didn't really know what to do with them. So unfortunately, because of that, I then started to abuse alcohol and drugs to get rid of those thoughts, to try and numb them, away from the view of my parents. I was doing them in my bedroom quite secretly a lot. And then I started to break down, and my parents didn't know why. I didn't know why. Again, it was very difficult to get psychological help at that point because obviously lockdown, COVID, the health services were under a lot of pressure. So that continued until I then returned to university in September 2020, sorry. So I continued to do the same. I was with my friends. We continued to drink, take drugs, until one night where I had it's a ketamine-induced psychotic episode occurred. For those of you that don't know the effects of ketamine, it's basically a dissociative drug. So it essentially can distort your perception of reality to make it feel as though you are in a film or like a video game. So like life isn't real. It also causes you to have delusions. So because I didn't think this was real, I thought the only way of getting out was to end my own life. So on the walk back from a friend's house after having some drinks and all that sort of stuff, I tried to run in front of a car, which my two friends who were walking home with me at the time stopped me from doing. They pulled me back, but were obviously incredibly scared. So we got into my flat, where I continued to have these delusions, and attempted to try and stab myself with a kitchen knife, which again, they fought off me. And while one of them was outside my room trying to call the police, they locked me in my room with one of the others. During this time, I was pretty dead set that I had to end my life there and then. It had to be then. The element of the alcohol and drugs gives you that there isn't that barrier to tell you this is totally wrong. This isn't what you should be doing. So I threw a glass at my friend's head to distract him. And while that happened, I ran to the window of my university flat. I climbed onto the neighbour's roof. I ran over that roof and dived off. I didn't stop to look over the roof. I didn't kind of think about what I was doing. I was dead set on that's exactly what I wanted to do. And that's exactly what I aimed to do, was to end my life. It was about 3 stories. So I fell about 25, 30 feet onto what I thought was going to be the pavement below. However, because of the trajectory of my jump, and I was so dead certain, I actually ended up hitting a parked car before I hit the pavement, which ultimately probably saved my life. I woke up in hospital with cuts, bruises. I've got a 6-inch scar down my stomach, which I probably will have for the rest of my life. I had a punctured lung. I was incredibly lucky to not have been paralyzed or shatter my pelvis. And I was even luckier to still be alive. My parents obviously were at home at the time, and I was at university, so they received a call on the door by the police at about 4 o'clock in the morning saying your son's just jumped off a roof and is in critical care. So they then jumped in a car to come and see me in hospital and took me home, which of course I was still at university at this point. And for some reason, I think I wanted the distraction more than anything. None of us wanted to admit that it was potentially an attempt at suicide. We all just thought it was this freak incident. And that's unfortunately what we all like to think is the best of it, because thinking of the worst is actually a horrible thing to do. But it was that realistically. However, it was very difficult for any of us to talk about. I wanted to push it away. And certainly if my parents thought I wanted to push it away and didn't accept that, then that is how it will be. So after 2 weeks of being at home, I actually returned to university, had some extenuating circumstances on my work. So I got some extensions, but I basically used my university work to distract myself from what had just happened and what I'd attempted. So I continued my university work, pretty much a 9 to 5, and then smoked a lot of cannabis in the evenings to numb the pain and numb the thoughts and basically stop myself from experiencing that post-traumatic stress. So I went through the whole of university, ended up graduating with a first, which obviously I'm extremely, extremely proud of. But then that distraction stopped. So I no longer had the work to focus on. I was living at home. I was then starting to work again. So I was driving about an hour and a half each way to work, which meant that I was left with my own thoughts. And the post-traumatic stress started to set in. I became incredibly depressed, incredibly angry, distant, just the real telltale signs of mental health deterioration, mental illness, and then eventually into mental health crisis. So it was only until I was away with friends in Bristol that I had an argument with one of them in a nightclub, and I punched a wall and broke my knuckle. So in that time, a couple of days later, I went to A&E to check, and it was in A&E where I was approached by a nurse and said, kind of, what happened? What did you do? What's going on? And I broke down. At that point, I was about a week away from attempting suicide again. I was planning to take my own life. I knew if I had left that A&E room that I was going to go and start self-harming again. So I knew that this was kind of my only opportunity to really get the help I needed. I didn't know I needed that help, though. You must remember that when you're actually that ill and consumed by your thoughts, that you don't really know that something is wrong. It sounds very strange, but you're kind of not in your own head, not in your own body. So I was admitted into hospital, and I spent 2 weeks in a specialist ward for mental illness, where I was given antidepressants. So I started on 100 milligrams of sertraline, which is an SSRI. So that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is a very common form of antidepressant. There's obviously different names for them and different drugs. But I was then discharged from hospital after 2 weeks, after massively improving in my mood, motivation. Really weirdly, like after a week of taking the drugs, it felt like this really dark, stormy cloud in my mind had began to fade away, and that you could start to see the sunlight again. Colors actually looked a bit brighter. I had more energy, more motivation. I started to eat better, sleep better. It was actually pretty amazing. But obviously that's just the day-to-day allowing me to cope. The drugs do. The real hard work was the psychotherapy. So when I was discharged, I had about 5 months of psychotherapy, where I really got to understand and process my emotions and thoughts and the traumas that I'd been through from the ages of 13, 14 to how old I am now. So through that, that's the real hard work that gets you to a far better place. The drugs allow me to cope on a day-to-day. I do see a massive difference if I do miss taking my medication for a day. Even if it's 4 or 5 hours later, I can tell there's a real drop in my mood. But that is unfortunately kind of the biology and genetics of it. So there's a lot of mechanisms and strategies that I've learned during therapy that allow me to recognize that I'm having a suicidal thought or a negative thought, and ways in which I can then turn those or flip those or counteract them in ways that are positive. So that's kind of my story. I'm now in a much better place. I was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which means a key thing of that disorder is that I have fluctuant mood swings. So for 2 days, I might be incredibly self-motivated. I might feel really self-important, really sociable. And then 2 days later, I'll be in a depressive slump. I mean, for the past 2 days, I've literally not been able to leave my bed. Just watched. You have to look after yourself, and being mentally ill is just as bad as being physically ill, really. You have to look after yourself, and you have to have that time to really rehabilitate and allow your body to kind of heal. So now I've worked my way down to 25 milligrams of sertraline, which is pretty amazing from just a year ago. But I still see myself being on them for a long time yet. And I am actually going back to therapy to continue. Just I wouldn't say I'm struggling again. It's just that sometimes there are things that need a professional perspective to shine the light on and then allow you to process it yourself, really. So yeah, that's kind of my story.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing all that, George. It was I'm really sorry that you had to go through all that, and I'm thank you for coming on today, even if you've been feeling awful the past 2 days.
Thank you. I mean, it's so important that I know that there are a lot of people out there that have gone through the same or similar and feel as though they can't talk about it or they don't know how to talk about it. So just having that ability to use my own experience to encourage or make people feel more safe and supported, then I would 100% do it.
100%. And I fully understand kind of the part that you said about not feeling like you're really in your own body, because I went through quite a bad depression when I was around 14, 15, which is still relatively young. And you kind of, I think it's just you don't really want to help yourself, or you don't really know how
Exactly.
to help yourself. Yeah, you know something's wrong, but it's just kind of taking that first step, isn't it?
You've also got those kind of negative bombarding thoughts like you've just got to think of like the worst positive, like the worst mental attitude, but it's not that, it's an illness. So it's like, it's not that you don't recognize it, it's the fact that like, oh, no one can help, or no one will help, or I don't want any help, or that nothing will help, like I'm just stuck like this for the rest of my life. It's really isolating and suffocating, isn't it?
And I wanted to say, George, as well, thank you for sharing your story, because it's quite personal what you've just said, and you've gone through a lot. And I want to take it back in terms of, you mentioned self-harming.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about, what you went through in terms of self-harming, if you're able to? And the reason why I'm asking this is so that our listeners can identify signs of self-harm.
Yes.
So what should they look out for?
Of course. So certainly with mine, you do it in private. So if you're spending if someone is spending a lot of time in private or in their bedroom with their door shut and things like that, sometimes it can be late at night when people are all in bed, which of course is very difficult. But the real signs that I suppose I did, the things that I did in order to make people not notice was kind of always wearing long sleeve tops or always wearing Under Armours. Even if it's boiling hot, I would be wearing them because it would be hiding my arms. Yeah, I think that's probably the main one. It's obviously very different for different people. My self-harm wasn't that I wanted to end my life at that point. It was actually more about self-punishment. It was more about, I didn't think I was good enough. I didn't think I was right in society. And for that reason, I started to punish myself by self-harming, which obviously self-harm can be different for other people. It could be also turn into an attempt to take their own life. But yeah, in my perspective, certainly really look out for just a dull mood, certainly being more reserved. Maybe if they are quite outgoing, if they seem more reserved and distant as well, not really paying attention, not really being connected in the room. I think because I start to notice my own self-harms and suicidal tendencies, and it's little things like potentially having health problems that I then don't go and get checked out, or I just leave. That's kind of a form of self-harm, because you're just, something could be wrong and you just don't go and get it checked out. You're just like, oh, well, that's just another thing wrong with me. So it can present itself in so many different ways. And I always say in mental health that it's so unique to the individual. Our brains and our personalities are so unique to us that one person may present it in a totally different way to another.
And I think that's quite important, because everyone is so different. This ties in nicely then into, for parents. What advice would you give to parents who have children that are going through or suffering with mental health or mental health illness?
My first thing is education. 110%, it's education. Learn about it. Go and research. The worst thing that you can be when you are ill yourself is feeling as though people don't understand you because they're not going through what you're going through. And as a parent, being able to research and really understand how the illness may present itself and how the child may be feeling or how someone may be feeling is so crucial to knowing how to then counteract it or do something to distract them from it. Or so certainly education for starters. Also, compassion and empathy is a massive thing, and in mental health especially, it's compassion is pretty strong because it's not, you don't have to go through it yourself to know or feel as though you can then console someone. So you don't have to have felt it yourself, but to know that how painful or how horrible it can be for someone else, to then just like be there to support them, be that shoulder. Another thing is I could always shy away because I wasn't asked directly how I was feeling and what I was going through. I understand as a parent, you don't want to be intrusive into your kids' lives, and it's important to give them that space and freedom. But I certainly think being more attentive and maybe it's not as kind of as such a big sign, but it's noticing little differences that might be adding up to make a big difference. So definitely asking the questions. It was so easy for me to hide away because I wasn't being asked. And especially it's become so accustomed in our society now to just say, like, when you meet someone, you're just like, oh, how are you? And you just say, oh, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? Or I'm good, thanks, how are you? We rarely ever then actually respond with, actually, I'm feeling pretty bad today. I'm not in a good place. And because of that, custom of just batting it off as if it is just a greeting and just saying hello, we're not getting to the roots, and we're not actually delving deeper. We're not getting to that deeper connection where you're then, and every single conversation I've had where someone's been like, oh, I'm not actually feeling it, you get to know them better. Like, you actually are making that human emotional connection that we all have, but have for some reason neglected or forgotten about.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think you always just say, oh yeah, I'm all right, thanks, even though you're going through some serious struggles. And I think going back to the parenting aspect, shout out to my mum, because everything you said that she kind of did. But I think the education part, I think 10 years ago or whenever it was that I went through it, there wasn't as much out there. And I think now it is much more of a normal thing now than it was back then. There's so many places that you can go and look kind of online, or even just calling up people just to ask these questions. I think also as a parent, you don't want to be kind of intrusive, because you don't want your kid to kind of be like, yeah, I'm fine, like, leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly. And you do get stroppy teenagers. Like, it's a time where you're going through hormones and things as well. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't think hormones were playing a part when I was that young as well. But it's an amalgamation of things, and mental illness especially. It's got so many different factors. It's biological, it's genetics, it's social, it's environmental. That there are so many influencing factors that can lead to someone developing a mental illness, that you can't just say it's one particular thing. There are so many different things that lead up to it and can cause it.
Yeah, 100%. I think, what are some of your kind of coping mechanisms? I know you spoke about the medication aspect and how that helped you to cope. Is there anything, I don't know if you want to speak a bit about medication and other things that kind of helped you to cope?
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting to highlight that coping mechanisms can both be good and bad. Just so that we're coping is kind of a different way of managing, I suppose. A lot of, I do get quite anxieties. I have a horrible habit of biting my nails to the point where they do just bleed. And that's, I suppose, a bad coping mechanism in ways of dealing with stressful and anxious situations. Some of my more positive things, I practice mindfulness. So mindfulness is so crucial. And mindfulness is all about staying and being being present. And that's being in the moment. It's not just like do you know, sometimes say you go on holiday or you do something fun on the weekend and the weekend's gone and you're like, Jesus, that's just passed so quickly, and I feel like it hasn't happened. And that's because you're not as present as you should be. You're not in the moment. You're obviously there, but mentally and emotionally, you're not aligned with what you're experiencing. So certainly mindfulness, especially walking in nature, I never really used to do. I was kind of forced to do it, but actually, I feel as though if people did really start to get into a routine of going and walking in national parks and things like that, that it's just beautiful. You can then connect with nature as well, and nature heals you. The sound of the birds, crunch of leaves, the sound of wind. If there's sun shining, we need our vitamin D. That is a beautiful way of grounding for me. And it's a form of meditation. A lot of people think meditation is you have to sit there and not think, but actually the whole point about meditation is noticing thought. It's noticing that you're having those things going through your mind and just letting them pass away, just not letting yourself worry about them.
Yeah, I think I did this thing called forest bathing, and you're just taking in all your surroundings and being really present, and it's something that you can take away on like any walk that you do. It doesn't have to be in the woods.
Exactly.
But I think it's important to I think we have a habit in this day and age to just put a podcast on or have these things kind of flooding into your thoughts.
Distract us. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's a lot of I've forgotten the word now. There's a lot of distraction and just things that are bombarding you. We live in a very intense society. Our work has been far too overstressed. Humans think that our kind of, or a lot of us think that our one purpose is to work and achieve the best status we can in our jobs, which of course is amazing, and that's a good means to kind of keep you motivated. But that isn't our purpose. Obviously, everyone has a different purpose, but just to work or to be worked that's not the solution, and can just end up either making your mental health worse, or act as a distraction from the troubles that you are having.
100%, George. And I think we have to put ourselves first in terms of, taking that time out to rest and mental well-being. It's spoken quite a lot, but putting it into action is even more important, I'd say. I wanted to cover, George, with you. In terms of language surrounding mental health, are there any issues or terms that you'd recommend people should not use or should use? Or what's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
myth surrounding mental health in general? What do you think these myths are, and how can we debunk them?
It's a very interesting conversation, and actually, if you haven't experienced the system, or been a part of it, then it's actually things that people might subconsciously say, or might feel as though they're saying the right thing, but actually can end up making someone who is struggling or mentally ill feel worse. So I just wanted to go over, so mental health, especially, so mental health in the corporate environment has been mixed up with mental illness as well. And I have to stress that they're two very different things. Mental health, everyone has it. It's like our physical health. Everyone has mental health. Mental health can be good and bad. The definition that I know of mental health is it's your psychological, emotional, and social well-being. Whereas mental illness is more about disorders or delusions, or kind of, well, things that are affected through genetics, your environment. There are so many different. So poor mental health can then lead to mental illness, but mental health and mental illness are two incredibly different things. That's definitely one thing that I stress, because anxiety and stress are part of mental health, but if it becomes very overwhelming and then begins to impact your day-to-day life, that's when it can come into being poor mental health and then into mental illness. So that's quite a big stressor that I have to definitely say, especially in corporate environments, because mental health is just this umbrella that they've shoved everything into, and it's not like that at all. There's another thing because of my own, so these are my own experiences, of course, but I've heard them said to other people as well. And it's not necessarily that the people know that they're saying the wrong thing. And I feel like that's the crucial thing to highlight in society, is that it's not necessarily that you're purposely saying it to negatively impact someone. It's that we're just not aware. So a lot of the time we can have our struggles invalidated. So just because you can't see what's going on, it's all going on in our mind, of course. Sometimes it can present itself physically, but saying kind of things like, are you just seeking attention? That's been said to me before. Or things like, you'll get over it, this is an illness. Just think of it as kind of things that are physical illnesses as well. You don't just get over them. It takes time to manage, rehabilitate, really kind of improve. And invalidating struggles by saying, like, look at everything you have. What would your friends and family think? Or look at the people that you'll leave behind. That's pushing the problem away from their internal troubles and trying to portray it onto, look, you're doing all right in life, so why do you think it's okay to have these problems, basically? And that totally invalidates the struggles. As an example, I was having a really interesting and lovely conversation. We had a plumber come in the other day, and he was so kind of really interested in what I had to say, and I actually ended up telling him the exact same story of my experience, and without him noticing or thinking, he just responded with like, "Oh, but that wouldn't kill you, would it?" And without him noting, and the thing was, he wanted to be compassionate, like he wanted to understand, and he wanted to really know what was going on with me, and it did seem like he cared. But that comment in that setting is like totally invalidating. That takes away everything from the fact that, like, what I was feeling, what exactly I wanted to do, how ill I was, and just said like, oh, but like that probably wouldn't kill you. And it's just like, damn.
Yeah. I think that's why, like, language is just so important, and how you approach people to talk about, because people want to talk about it, and you just want to make it more of a normal thing, don't you? Like,
Exactly.
you don't want
You want
to.
you want to normalize the conversation. You want to like, and the more you do speak about it, the only reason why people don't know that there's a problem in saying those kind of things is because they've never been confronted with that conversation before.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to start, even if you're not struggling with your mental health, or if you just have kind of a stressful or anxious day, just speaking about that in conversation, it will make you feel better therapeutically. That's what happens a hell of a lot. Like, speaking about your struggles actually allows you to get them out there, but it also normalizes the conversation. It attunes people's hearing and thinking to then diving into those kind of conversations. So when you are confronted with it again, you know how to compose yourself, and you know what's better to say and what maybe you should avoid saying and things like that. So definitely, again, we can't desensitize people from the conversation. So you can't. It's a fine line, of course, and who is to say what is that line? But making sure that you don't just desensitize people so that, oh, it's just another one kind of thing. You can't get to that point, but having the strength and courage to talk about your mental health in a social setting, to allow people to understand that it is okay to talk about it, and that will then allow people to understand the language that's. So again, in terms of language, commit suicide, I never ever say commit anymore. Ever say commit. The reason why people say commit is because I think it was in the early 1900s or something. It was a crime to commit suicide. That's why it's commit suicide. So it's far more compassionate to say that they took their own life or they died by suicide. Because committing, again, you commit murder, you commit a crime, and unfortunately, the only crime involved in suicide is the fact that someone was so ill and felt that, like, there was no help or no one that they could speak to, that was their only way out.
Yeah, you're so right. I think when you put it like that, I've never really thought of that phrase in that kind of way as committing a crime, committing suicide. It's quite, when you put it like that, it's really powerful. And I know you do a lot of work kind of going into different businesses and different schools to kind of give talks on mental health. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and the kind of reactions that you've had?
Yeah, of course. That's so the talks is definitely the thing that I want to continue pushing, because like I said, education is the first step in breaking down stigmas, stereotypes, discriminations. As long as we are more educated, that allows us to form a better opinion and awareness of topics where you may not realize that you are discriminating or stigmatizing something. So 100% my focus is on secondary schools. I do my suicide prevention talk, so I talk about my lived experience, tailor it to different year groups. Of course, I don't want to scare year sevens. But the older through the school, I then do to make the story more raw and more real and more accurate to detail. But other than so that's all about early education, because that's my exact thinking for it is I wish that I had someone to come into my school and tell me that story when I was that age, because then I would have definitely spoken up. I would have definitely done something about it, because there was nothing there, because there was no education. I didn't know I didn't know where to go to. I also then tailor the talks as well. So if it's workplace, I do a lot on stress and anxiety, because stress, anxiety, and depression are the most common reasons for people taking days off work, so sickness leave, and that might mean that they aren't actually disclosing that to their company. If they have a day off because of their mental health, they're likely to say, oh, I just kind of have a bug or feel sick, or they're not actually likely to tell the reason. So it's about creating a culture, an environment that is safe and supportive for people to actually be able to talk about their mental health. I do similar in schools as well. So recently I did a talk to Glyn School Sixth Form, which was actually the secondary school that I went to. And a lot of that was tailored about stress and anxiety of A-levels and exams. Looking back now, I definitely was feeling a lot of stress, and I'm sure all of us did during that time. Exams were a hell of a lot of pressure. It's a big change in your life, then going into maybe secondary education, higher education, into university, or going off doing work, going traveling. There's a lot of stressful stuff going on at that age, and if you're not aware, and if you're not understanding of the emotions and feelings that are going through your body at the time, you're kind of like, what's wrong with me? Or it builds up and can end up overflowing and amalgamating into things that can so easily be prevented if there was just the education there in the first place.
Thank you, George. And George, I just want to say as well, from the comment that you made, as a former policeman, what you said about committing suicide and the term used, that's incredibly powerful. And it's made me think. And the reason why I'm saying that it's made me think is because as a former police officer, I've attended numerous incidents where someone has attempted to take their own lives. And I think that there's a ripple effect. It doesn't just impact that person or their family, but also everyone who's involved afterwards around the ecosystem. So officers, paramedics, or the ambulance, everyone. And personally, and again, I just want to make it clear that this is a personal opinion. I don't think that police should be dealing with this, because they're only trained to an extent. And I think professional medicals should be able to deal with mental health or mental illness related incidents. I just wanted to mention as well, you said about creating that safe and supportive environment. What or how can this be done in the workplace, for example?
So thank you very much, Vijay. And definitely this is a top-down approach. You see it in society, you see it in businesses. It's incredibly difficult for someone at the bottom of the hierarchy to try and push through initiatives, push through structures and projects that get that level of care and attention. Like I said, everyone has mental health. So trying to just push it on your associates or lower down the hierarchy doesn't suit. It's for everyone, like it has to be for everyone. So certainly creating initiatives So with my company at Optimal Minds, we call ourselves a psychological strategy consultant because we're actually focusing on executives and managers understanding and processing their own emotional intelligence and awareness to then project it onto their teams, speak about their mental health about their teams, which then starts to create an environment. If your manager, if your superior responds badly to something that of an emotive or emotional topic, then you're far less likely to talk to them about it. You just and this is the exact same thing with mental illness, mental health. If you're struggling and you reach out to someone and they neglect or reject your outreach, the chances of them then feeling as though they cannot talk to anyone, or it reinforces their negative thoughts to say that no one does care, no one can help. It just reinforces it. So it's all about that compassion and empathy. It's so important, and I understand that compassion and empathy it forms when we're a child. They do really interesting studies of kids playing in nurseries and sharing toys or snatching toys, and that is a really good indicator of the empathy and compassion that you then grow up to develop as well. It's incredibly difficult to change, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. I wouldn't say it's impossible. So a top-down approach is really how it will spread across and disseminate across the masses in teams, corporates, that kind of thing. Definitely.
Yeah, I think it is it's beginning to be a huge it needs to be a responsibility of managers and of leadership teams.
Yeah.
Because I think this is such a taboo topic in the workplace, isn't it? You don't really tend to go and talk to your colleagues about your mental health struggles.
Exactly.
And it should definitely be a normalised thing. So I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing, George. And I think we need more people doing things like this just to spread the awareness. We always ask our guests this last question, and it is, if you could give one key takeaway from this episode to the audience, what would it be?
Wow.
I know it's a big question, isn't it?
I suppose I like to stress it a lot, and it's about education and compassion and empathy. Just because you're not going through it, it doesn't mean someone else isn't. We have, and I know it can get into a touchy subject talking about ego, but our ego does like to protect us from our surroundings and keep us in a comfort zone. And our ego likes to think that we're totally capable of handling a situation if someone is suicidal or really struggling. But from my experience, I'd probably say that their ego is getting in the way. There could be a lot more done, especially in terms of then educating yourself on illnesses and how to properly have the conversation. There are so many charities out there that actually pose different ways of asking your friend or family how to talk about your mental health or if you're struggling. The interesting thing is that it was another myth to say about debunking. Asking about suicide, if you're worried about someone and you think they might be suicidal or thinking they might be thinking about attempting suicide, asking them isn't going to plant the seed. It's actually going to show them that you're willing and able and compassionate enough to have a conversation of such a topic. It can be very hard hitting. It can be very difficult, but it shows that you have that empathy and compassion to really care about someone's well-being in their life. At the end of the day, it's a life-threatening illness. That's the be-all and end-all, really. Empathy and compassion and just education.
Thank you, George, and thank you for coming on our podcast. It's been super impactful, and I know for a fact that this is going to educate a lot of the listeners as well. So thank you for coming on our podcast, and that's all for today's episode on mental health with our amazing guest, George, where we discussed his personal journey as well as how we can create a safer, more supportive workplace environment.
Yeah, I just also wanted to say thank you, George. You've spoken so openly about your experiences and touched on some really important areas. And yeah, thank you to our listeners for joining us this week. Please make sure you're following the podcast on Spotify, and feel free to give it a rating and review too.
Finally, before we go, just wanted to give out a shout out to George's Sully's Open Conversation. It's about having these conversations and breaking down the stigma of mental health. Feel free to go and check this out on all platforms.
If you're affected by what was covered in this episode, then please reach out to resources and organisations like Samaritans, Calm, Papyrus UK, or talk to the person you trust most. But if I can emphasise anything, please do not stay silent.
With the festive period around the corner, let's be more kind to each other. Our next episode will be dropping shortly, so keep your eyes peeled. And thank you again, and we'll see you next time on Diversity and Inclusion, Satisfying the Tick Box.